It was a typical Halloween night in my neighborhood, and everything seemed perfect, while the jack-o'-lanterns lit up the streets. There was a smell of caramel and candy in the air, and the excitement was palpable. I, Tommy, 13 years old, was dressed as a zombie. My costume was pretty convincing, with fake wounds and some makeup that left my face pale and greenish. My candy bag was almost full, weighing down my hands, and I was determined to make a few more stops before heading home. As I walked, I watched the other kids in their creative costumes, some as witches, others as ghosts or monsters. I heard laughter and excited screams, and the atmosphere was charged with festive energy. It was a Halloween like I'd always dreamed of, but as I moved away from the hustle and bustle, things started to change. When I passed down a more secluded street, I noticed a house at the end of the road. It was different from the others. It had no Halloween decorations and looked abandoned. The windows were covered in dust, and the door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. The other kids avoided the house, throwing furtive glances, but something inside me felt an irresistible curiosity. The house was a mystery, and I loved mysteries. As I got closer, my heart began to race. The darkness around seemed deeper, and the silence was deafening. I wondered what could be waiting inside. Would it just be an old man? Or maybe a bunch of candy? My doubts were quickly overshadowed by curiosity. Before I knew it, I was at the entrance. The door opened before me, as if inviting me in. As soon as I stepped inside, an old man appeared at the door. He wore a simple mask that covered just the upper part of his face and had a forced smile. He didn't seem particularly friendly, but he wasn't hostile either. "Trick or treat?" he asked, as if he were respecting the tradition. I hesitated, but my curiosity and the possibility of getting some candy outweighed my fear. "Treat," I replied, a mix of nervousness and expectation. He looked at me for a few seconds that felt eternal, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. After a moment, he said, "Come in, young man. I have the best candy in the neighborhood." His words sounded almost hypnotizing, and I couldn't resist the invitation. The house was strangely empty, with a few old pieces of furniture and dim lighting that seemed to come from a flickering lamp in the hallway. The air was thick with the smell of mold, and a feeling of discomfort began to creep over me. Still, the promise of shiny, tasty candies pushed me to keep going. The man led me to the kitchen, where I was shocked to see a big bowl full of chocolates and candies that looked top-notch, glimmering under the weak light. "Take as much as you want," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. As I approached the bowl, my stomach growled with anxiety and excitement. I looked at the candies, trying to ignore the strange feeling enveloping me. The man seemed more and more like a sinister figure as I grabbed the sweets, but my craving for treats was stronger. As I filled my bag with candy, the man pulled out a chair and sat down, watching me closely. Then he began to ask questions that made me uncomfortable. "Where are your parents? Who are you with tonight?" With each question, I felt something was off. His words were kind, but there was an undertone that made me feel exposed. I tried to stay calm and answered quickly, eager to leave that strange house. But as I turned toward the door, I realized it was locked. My heart raced. A sense of panic started to creep over me. The man slowly stood up, still wearing that smile that now looked grotesque. "You know, kid, I was young like you once. I love going out on Halloween too. But in my time, we didn't have so much freedom." His words sounded like a warning. His wrinkled, tired face seemed more threatening by the second. The reality began to crumble around me, and a deep fear invaded my body. I needed to get out of there. I tried to run, but he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. His icy grip made me feel like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. He pulled me toward the basement, and the thought of being dragged into the darkness made my stomach turn. I knew I couldn't let that happen. The fight for my freedom had begun. The smell in the basement was awful, a mix of mold and something that smelled rotten. The darkness enveloped everything, and the only light came from a flickering bulb that swung, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. As the man pushed me inside, my survival instinct kicked in. I looked around, searching for an escape, but all I saw were photos plastered on the walls, all of kids with smiles that looked forced. The atmosphere weighed down on me like a burden. "These are the kids who came here before you," the man said, as he slowly moved through the space. He seemed at home in that place, as if the darkness didn't bother him. They never needed another Halloween night. His words echoed in my mind, and a chill ran down my spine. What did he mean by that? Panic began to consume me. In the corner of the basement, I saw a wooden box covered by a blood-stained cloth. My heart raced. "What's in there?" I asked, my voice trembling, but he just smiled with a look that made it clear he wasn't going to answer. "Just a little gift for those who dare to enter." I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to get out of there, but my legs felt paralyzed. The reality of what was happening started to hit me like a punch in the gut. The man was getting closer, and each of his steps seemed to echo off the walls. I needed a plan. With a burst of adrenaline, I realized I couldn't let him catch me. I instinctively reacted, biting his hand with all the strength I had. He screamed in pain, letting go of my arm. I seized the opportunity and ran for the stairs. The basement door was just a few steps away, but the darkness felt infinite. Every second counted. I rushed up the stairs with a speed I never knew I had. My heart was pounding, and my breath was ragged. When I reached the door, I realized it was locked. I looked back, and the man was there. The mask now fallen to the floor, revealing that wrinkled face and the scar that made him even scarier. He looked furious, and I knew I had no time to waste. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I pushed the door with all my strength. To my surprise, it gave way, and I managed to burst into the hallway. The fresh air of Halloween night hit me like a blow, and I realized the party outside continued, unaware of what was happening in there. The laughter and screams of children were distant, like an echo of a life I desperately wanted to return to. I ran out of the house, not looking back. All I wanted was to get far away, but the man's words still echoed in my mind. The kids who come here never need another Halloween night. I felt a shiver at the thought of what that could mean, but it wasn't time to get lost in thought. My life was at stake. The next morning, the police arrived at the house. I was there, still shaking and not knowing how to explain everything that had happened. I talked to the officers about the man and the house, but when they went inside, all they found was the unlocked door, the bowl of candy on the counter, and an empty basement except for the wooden box. The house was abandoned and empty, as if it had never housed anyone. Inside the box, remains of children who had disappeared decades ago were found, but there was no sign of the man. It was Halloween, and the town was in a kind of festive trance, filled with costumes, skeleton decorations, and illuminated pumpkins. The atmosphere was heavy, almost magical. I was excited for the party at Mike's place, a longtime friend. He always threw the best parties, and this night would be no different. We were all ready to have fun and leave our daily worries behind. When I arrived at Mike's house, the loud music was already pulsing, and the smell of typical Halloween food filled the air. The house was packed with friends, all dressed up and ready for fun. I was dressed as a zombie, a costume that always amused me, and soon joined my friends, toasting with cups full of red punch that surely had some kind of alcohol mixed in. The vibe was great, and the hours flew by with dancing and lively conversations. Then, in the midst of all this, someone, probably Alex, suggested we do something more exciting. "How about playing with a Ouija board?" he said with a teasing smile, trying to get everyone hyped. I chuckled a bit at that. To me, it was all nonsense. I never believed in ghosts or spirits. I always thought it was just a way to scare people. However, the idea started to sound appealing as the night wore on. The room was lit only by a few candles and the Halloween lights flickering on the walls. Once the idea was accepted, we headed to the living room, where the atmosphere felt darker. We set up the board on the floor, surrounded by candles. The tension began to rise. Some people laughed nervously, but I could sense a mix of excitement and fear in the air. With the lights off, we sat down in a circle, and the darkness seemed to swallow the rest of the party. Alex started to explain how it all worked. "Just touch the pointer and ask something," he said, nervously smiling. "If there's a spirit nearby, it will answer." We laughed, but there was something about that night that felt different. The air was denser, almost electrified, and a strange feeling began to creep over me. As we settled in and placed our hands on the pointer, the mood shifted. The room fell silent, and the sound of laughter was replaced by a distant murmur. The first movement was soft, almost imperceptible, but soon it became clear that the pointer was moving, as if it had a life of its own. "Oh, who's pushing this?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but the truth was my stomach was in knots. Then suddenly, the first candle extinguished by itself. The silence in the room intensified, and I could hear my own breathing. I looked at my friends, and their expressions showed they were just as confused as I was. But instead of leaving, we decided to continue. Someone suggested we ask something simple, like the name of a spirit. I was ready to laugh it off, but as the board began to move, my confidence started to waver. The room felt cold, and a shiver ran down my spine as the pointer began to spell my name. Scariest. Nervous laughter echoed around the room, but there was an underlying fear that everyone was trying to hide. And when the board spelled the message, "I know what you did last Halloween," my heart stopped. At that moment, the memory of last Halloween flashed back, and my blood ran cold. I remembered what I had done with Sarah, my ex-girlfriend. She wanted to break up with me, and in a thoughtless act, I decided to leak those intimate photos of her. At the time, I was blinded by rage and hurt pride, never thinking it would have such severe consequences. Sarah disappeared soon after, and I always wondered if she was okay or what really happened to her. What was once a secret of mine was now exposed in front of everyone, and the weight of guilt began to suffocate me. The room grew tense. Everyone fell silent, and the atmosphere completely changed. What had once been a fun game was now turning serious, and I found myself caught between the desire to stop the game and the need to know how far this would go. I tried to convince myself it was all a big joke, but the growing fear within me wouldn't let me ignore the gravity of the situation. What else could the board reveal? The silence dragged on, and I didn't know what to do. All my friends were as paralyzed as I was. The weight of those words hung in the air. "I know what you did last Halloween." That phrase echoed in my mind, and I wanted to scream, wanted to leave, but something held me back. A kind of curiosity and fear intertwined, keeping me from moving. Alex, trying to break the tension, decided to ask something silly. "What's your name?" And the board, almost as if challenging our sanity, began to move again. The letters appeared slowly, forming words we didn't recognize. But to my surprise, the answer was clear. Nathan. The looks turned to me, and I noticed the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer a game. People started looking around, as if expecting something terrifying to appear at any moment. The tension in the room was palpable. Alex asked if Nathan was a spirit, and the board responded yes, firmly, the pointer trembling over the letters. My heart raced as the board moved again, this time toward me. "What else do you know about me?" I asked, unsure of what to expect. The answer was quick and direct. "You will pay." The nervous laughter I had before had vanished. I felt as if I were being watched, as if the walls of the room were closing in, and the warmth of the party was quickly replaced by an intense cold. Nathan's figure started to take shape in my mind, and I realized he was Sarah's older brother who had died years ago. Before he passed, he asked me to take care of his sister, but I hadn't been able to keep my promise. No one seemed to know what was happening. The atmosphere, once filled with celebration, had become dense and heavy. The candles seemed to flicker, and the light wavered, almost as if something was interfering. The air was thick with fear, and the laughter and conversations from the party now felt distant, like an echo from a time that no longer existed. As the board continued to spell out cryptic messages, another candle suddenly went out. The sound of the wick burning down was deafening in the silence of the room. The darkness deepened, and I could feel the panic spreading among my friends. The space around us was changing. What was once a familiar room now felt claustrophobic. That's when the board moved again, spelling something that made my heart stop. "PY." A whisper spread across the room, and the looks on my friends' faces showed they, too, were starting to grasp the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't just some spirit visiting us. Something far deeper, far more sinister, was happening, something beyond our understanding. Desperate, I tried to regain control. "Enough of this!" I shouted, but my voice sounded weak, barely audible against the intensity of the moment. The planchette stopped moving, but the tension in the room was so thick it felt like something was about to explode. One of my friends started staring into the corner of the room, his face twisted in horror, which made me worry. "Clarence, are you okay?" Someone asked, but I couldn't respond. It was as if something had gripped my throat. The candles flickered even more, and the shadows danced wildly on the walls. That's when the last candle went out, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in, and we all scrambled to get up and find the door. But before anyone could move, I heard a whisper, louder and clearer than anything I'd ever heard. "I know what you did." Those words echoed like a scream in my mind. A deep, paralyzing fear gripped me. What I had done to Sarah, my secret, was now out in the open for everyone to see. Nervous laughter turned into screams of panic, and I saw my friends running for the exit. As I tried to follow them, a cold hand grabbed my wrist. I looked down, and what I saw froze me in place. A shadow moved quickly through the darkness, its gaze fixed on me. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. "Leave me alone!" I wanted to yell, but the words died in my throat. In desperation, I threw the board on the ground and bolted out of the party, my only thought being to escape that terrifying night. Running out of the house felt like it took forever. My feet pounded against the ground, each step heavier than the last. The cold Halloween breeze whipped against my face, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get away from that place and that damn board. I barely realized I was home again, the door slamming shut behind me, locking the terror outside. Inside my house, the sense of safety quickly turned into an oppressive dread. The silence was deafening. What had happened at the party replayed in my mind. The words from the board echoed. "I know what you did last Halloween." The weight of my secret, which I thought was buried, now resurfaced, more alive than ever. That night, the fear wouldn't let me rest. As I lay in bed, I started hearing whispers coming from the hallway. A familiar voice murmured, repeating, "I know what you did." At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were several, echoing down the hallway as if they were closing in on me. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, and I felt drawn out of my room. With each step I took, the voices grew clearer. "Why did you do it, Clarence? Why?" The weight of guilt crushed me. I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or if reality was falling apart around me. As I reached the hallway, the lights began to flicker, and I saw a shadow moving at the end. It was a hooded figure, standing still, staring right at me. Fear took over, and even though I knew I should turn back, I couldn't move. The figure extended its hand, and a sharp pain shot through my chest. It felt like someone was gripping my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter. "You'll pay for what you did," the figure whispered, and I was forced to confront the truth. Memories of the night I leaked those photos flooded my mind. Sarah's desperate look, the silence that followed when she disappeared. Everything started to intertwine. There was no escaping anymore. I tried to scream, but it came out as a whisper. The room spun, and I found myself collapsing to the floor. The pain in my chest was unbearable, and I knew there was no escaping what I had done. The next morning, my friends were worried since they hadn't heard from me. They knocked on the door several times, but I couldn't respond. When they finally came in, the scene they found was horrifying. I was lying on the floor in my bedroom, naked, my eyes vacant, my skin pale. The expression of terror was still frozen on my face, locked in that final moment of panic. They called the police, but the truth was I was already gone, trapped in a battle with my own demons. What happened that Halloween night would remain a mystery to them, but the truth was crystal clear to me. The guilt had consumed me, and there was no going back. You know that time of year when people decorate their houses with paper ghosts, carved pumpkins, and hanging skeletons? It's Halloween, of course. In my neighborhood, it was like an unwritten rule. On that night, anything went. It wasn't just about dressing up and asking for candy. There was a second part, a part we took seriously, the tricks. And when I say anything goes, I mean anything. Me, Matt, and Luke were the kings of those pranks. Always were. Every Halloween, we planned something different. Small things at first, like TPNG the neighbor's trees or putting shaving cream in mailboxes. But over time, we wanted more. It had to be bigger, crazier. And that year, I felt like it was our chance to do something that everyone would remember. It was Luke who came up with the idea. He mentioned a house at the end of the street. You know, that kind of house every neighborhood has. Always dark, nobody outside, kind of abandoned. Nobody really knew who lived there. Some said no one did. Others swore there was an old man who hated kids, especially on Halloween night. Man, let's mess with that guy, I said, already feeling the adrenaline kick in. If he's not giving out candy, he's going to get a real trick. In our heads, it was perfect. The plan was simple. Start with the usual stuff, toilet paper, eggs, and maybe some spray paint if we were feeling bold. Then the night came. We got dressed up, grabbed our bags, and hit the streets, going door to door like everyone else. Trick or treat, the usual phrase. But while the other kids were focused on candy, our minds were on something else. The old man's house. That was the grand finale of the night. Every house we passed, we picked up some candy, but deep down, we knew the real fun was still ahead. When we finally got to the house, I swear, it looked creepier than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the windows covered in grime. This is it, I said, trying to sound confident. Let's finish this. We started with the toilet paper. Me and the guys were laughing, watching as the white strips tangled in the trees, swaying in the wind. It was going great, but I wanted more, so I grabbed the eggs. With a steady hand, I threw the first one right at the front door. The sound of it splattering was perfect. That goo dripping down the wood. That's what I'm talking about. Nice one, Jason, Matt shouted, grabbing his own egg and doing the same. We were laughing, having a blast, throwing more eggs while Luke was chucking toilet paper onto the roof. Everything was going as planned, and the sense of getting away with it just kept growing. No one had come out to stop us, and the house remained as quiet as ever. Until suddenly, out of nowhere, the porch light turned on. It was like someone had flipped a switch and turned on the "you're screwed" signal. The laughter died instantly. The sound of eggs hitting the ground stopped, and there, standing at the door, which was now slightly open, was a man. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and from where we stood, he looked old, really old. But the weirdest part? His face. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like it was covered in shadows. Even with the porch light on, parts of his face just wouldn't show. It was like the darkness was stuck to him. He stood there for a few seconds, just staring at us. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Trick or trick, boys?" His voice was low, raspy. You know when someone talks way too calmly, and it just makes you uncomfortable? It was like that. I felt Matt freeze up next to me, and Luke breathing fast behind me. We didn't know what to do. We waited for him to yell at us, to threaten to call the cops. But instead, the guy smiled. A strange smile, too wide, like it wasn't natural. "You want a real trick?" he asked. For a second, I thought about running. Every instinct I had was screaming to get out of there. But, being the idiot I am, I opened my mouth and, trying to sound brave, answered, "Yeah, what are you going to do, old man?" At that moment, he stepped forward. The house lights flickered, and I felt the ground tremble slightly beneath my feet. Not an earthquake, but a weird vibration like something had moved underground. His voice got even lower, almost a whisper. "You don't know what you're asking for." And that's when everything changed. In that second, it was like the whole world flipped. The doors of the house, which had been just slightly open, slammed wide with a bang, like some invisible force had shoved them hard. We stood there, frozen, unsure what to do. I don't know if it was fear or if we were actually stuck, but it felt like our feet were glued to the ground. And then something invisible, a force, I guess, pulled us in. I'm not talking about a breeze or a light shove. No, it was like the wind had hands and yanked us, dragging all three of us straight into the house. Everything went black the moment we crossed the door, like total darkness so thick it felt like I'd gone blind. I tried to scream, but it was like the sound wouldn't come out. I could hear Luke and Matt trying to do the same, but it was like our voices were being smothered by the dark. We kept getting pulled in, and when we finally stopped, the lights came back. But in this weird way. It was a dim, yellow light, like those old bulbs you see flickering in horror movies. Flicker, flicker, and then you see where you are. We were in a living room, but it was different from any living room I'd ever seen. The floor was old wood, creaking with every step. The walls, covered in faded wallpaper, had dark stains that looked like dried blood. But what really freaked me out were the pictures. The walls were covered in them. Old photos in worn-out frames, all of kids. Crying kids. Some looked like they were screaming, others were tied up. You know when you see something so wrong that your brain takes a second to catch up? That's exactly how it felt. I turned to look at the others. Matt was pale, almost ghostly. Luke could barely move. No one said a word. That's when I noticed in the corner of the room, there was a huge mirror. It wasn't a normal mirror. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt off somehow. The kind of mirror you look into and feel like you're seeing something you shouldn't. And then we saw a reflection. Only it wasn't us. I mean, it was, but at the same time, it wasn't. Our reflections were distorted. Like, our faces were swollen, with eyes that looked like they were melting, mouths twisted into silent screams. It was like the mirror showed a version of us that, well, that shouldn't exist. That's when his voice echoed through the room. "Welcome to my trick." I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was coming from everywhere, and the guy, that old man, he was in the mirror. Only he wasn't in the room. It was like he was inside the mirror, staring at us, smiling that creepy smile. And the worst part? He didn't seem like just a reflection. It was like he controlled it, like he'd been waiting for us. "You love tricks, don't you?" he said, and his smile just kept getting wider. I swear, I tried to run. I tried, but it was like my legs just stopped working, like the ground had trapped me there. Next to me, Matt started to quietly cry. Luke, he was whispering apologies, repeating, I'm sorry, like that would change anything. But the old man in the mirror just watched. He didn't care about our fear. He just wanted to watch. The room felt darker and darker, the air growing heavier. I looked at my friends and realized they were changing too. Not just in the reflection, but for real. Luke's face started to twist, slowly, like in the mirror. Matt was holding his head in his hands, like he was in pain, and I felt this weird pressure on my own face. I knew something terrible was going to happen if we stayed there any longer. And then, like a snap, the lights came back on, all of a sudden, like nothing had happened. The three of us were outside the house again, collapsed on the ground, breathing heavy, gasping for air. It was like we had been spat out. I looked up, and there he was, the old man, standing on the porch with that smile. "Happy Halloween, boys," he said, like he had just handed out candy. Then, calmly, he closed the door. We got up as fast as we could and ran. We ran like our lives depended on it because, honestly, they probably did. I don't know how we made it out, but we did. But at that moment, I knew it wasn't over yet. That run back home was the most desperate thing I've ever experienced. None of us looked back, and I could hear Matt and Luke's footsteps rushing behind me, like hell itself was chasing us. We reached home, slammed the door shut, and just stood there, breathing hard, trying to process what the hell had just happened. But deep down, we knew the nightmare wasn't over. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned in bed, every sound outside making me jump. The wind, the trees, even the creaking of my bed felt off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection in the mirror. My face twisted, grotesque. It was like the image was burned into my brain, and the more I thought about it, the more terrified I got. The next day, we decided to go back, this time with our parents. I know it sounds crazy, but we had to understand what had happened. Plus, there was something else, something I couldn't explain, but it made me feel like the house wouldn't be there the same way we had seen it. And that's exactly what happened. When we got there, the house looked different. Old, abandoned, like no one had lived there in decades. The windows were shattered, the roof was caving in, and the yard, which had looked normal the night before, was now overgrown with weeds and dead plants. The parents looked at us, confused, like they thought we had made everything up. I tried to explain, I tried to show where we had thrown the eggs, where we had sprayed the graffiti, but there was no sign of anything. No trace that we had ever been there. All that was left was that strange feeling in the air, like something was watching us from afar, laughing. After that day, life went back to normal. Well, for Matt and Luke, at least. They seemed to move on, trying to forget that night like it was just another Halloween prank gone wrong. But for me, things only got worse. Every time I walked by a mirror, something fell off. At first, it was just small details. A shadow on the side of my face that I didn't remember seeing before, or a strange smile that I was sure I hadn't made. But as time went on, it got worse. Much worse. I started seeing my reflection move when I didn't. Like, I'd stand still, staring at the mirror, and my reflection would tilt its head, or blink in a way I hadn't. It was like there was another version of me, trapped in there, waiting for the right moment to come out. I even told my parents about it, but of course they thought it was all in my head. "You're just spooked from Halloween," they'd say. It was just a bad prank, but I knew it wasn't. One night, the worst thing happened. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, when I felt that same chill again, like the one I felt in the house. I turned to look in the mirror, and there I was. Except, it wasn't me. My reflection was there, smiling. But not my smile. It was the same creepy smile the old man had. The same smile from the mirror in the house. I stumbled back, nearly falling to the floor. And the reflection? It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with that smile like it was waiting. And then it spoke. "You thought it was over, Jason?" I screamed. But again, the sound got stuck in my throat. I ran to my room, slammed the door, and stayed there, shaking, trying to figure out what was happening. But I knew. That prank, it had never ended. Something had stayed with me. Something I'd never be able to get rid of. And that's when I knew that somehow, that house had cursed us. Or maybe it was the old man. I don't know. All I know is that since that night, I've never been the same. Every time I look in the mirror, I see it. That distorted reflection, watching me, waiting like it's getting closer and closer to becoming the only version of me. And over time, I started avoiding mirrors. Because deep down, I know what's going to happen. One day, when I look at that reflection again, it's going to be him, not me, who steps out. And I won't be able to stop it. And that's the scariest part. It wasn't just a Halloween prank gone wrong. That old man, that house, they messed with us in ways we could have never imagined. I don't know if Matt and Luke still feel it, but me, I'm stuck with it. Forever.